In the dense jungles of the Pacific Theater during the Second World War, thousands of stories unfolded that would never make it into history books. Tales of young men thrust into circumstances beyond their control, forced to make choices that would ripple through time in ways they could never imagine. This is one such story, about a Japanese tank crewman whose single decision, born not from heroism or cowardice, but from pure desperation and humanity, would inadvertently alter the course of military intelligence and save countless lives on both sides of the conflict. If you're fascinated by untold stories from World War II and want to discover more hidden chapters of history, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these forgotten narratives to light. Takeshi Nakamura was 23 years old when he found himself commanding a Type 97 Chiha medium tank in the oppressive humidity of New Guinea in 1943. Born in a small fishing village outside Yokohama, Takeshi had grown up with the smell of salt water and the sound of nets being mended on wooden docks. His father repaired boat engines, and Takeshi had inherited his mechanical aptitude, spending his teenage years learning to coax life from stubborn machinery. That skill had made him valuable to the Imperial Japanese Army, but it had also sealed his fate, sending him thousands of miles from home to fight in a war whose grand strategies he barely understood. The tank crew consisted of 4 men crammed into a steel box that became an oven under the tropical sun. Takeshi served as the driver, wedged into the forward left position with limited visibility through a small viewing port. To his right sat Corporal Hideaki Sato, the hull machine gunner, a former schoolteacher from Osaka, who recited poetry to himself during quiet moments. Above them, in the turret, Commander Lieutenant Kenji Yamada barked orders with the certainty of a man who had never questioned authority, while Gunner Private Ichiro Tanaka, barely 19, operated the main cannon with hands that still trembled during combat. They had been stationed near Leh for 6 weeks. Their tank dug into a defensive position overlooking a supply route the Allies desperately wanted to control. Every day brought the distant rumble of artillery and the closer buzz of reconnaissance aircraft. Every night brought mosquitoes, dysentery, and the knowledge that their supply lines were growing thinner while the enemies grew stronger. It was a Tuesday morning, though the days had long since blurred together when everything changed. The attack came not with warning, but with the sudden shriek of incoming mortars that sent dirt and shrapnel spraying across their position. Takeshi's hands moved on instinct, firing the engine as Lieutenant Yamada shouted coordinates through the internal communication system. The jungle around them erupted in smoke and fire as American forces, supported by Australian infantry, pushed forward with an intensity that spoke of careful planning and superior numbers. For 3 hours they held their position, the tank's cannon booming as Tanaka fired round after round at targets Takeshi could barely see through his limited viewport. Beside him, Sato's machine gun chattered in short, controlled bursts. The air inside the tank grew thick with cordite smoke and the smell of hot metal. Sweat poured down Takeshi's face, stinging his eyes as he maneuvered the tank through the churned earth, trying to present a harder target while maintaining their defensive position. Then came the sound that every tank crew dreaded, a metallic clang that rang through the hull like a bell. They had been hit. The tank lurched, and Takeshi felt the steering grow sluggish. Another impact, this one closer to the turret, and suddenly Lieutenant Yamada's voice cut off mid-sentence. Takeshi glanced up through the driver's hatch and saw blood dripping from above. Tanaka was screaming something, his young voice cracking with panic. Sato grabbed Takeshi's arm, his eyes wide behind his glasses, and pointed to smoke beginning to seep into the crew compartment. The decision to abandon the tank came not from training, but from the primal need to survive. Takeshi threw open his hatch, sucking in humid air that tasted like freedom compared to the smoke-filled interior. Sato scrambled out beside him, both men rolling into a shell crater as machine gun fire kicked up dirt where they had been standing. Behind them, their tank, their home for the past 6 weeks, sat silent and burning. Tanaka emerged from the turret, his uniform soaked with what Takeshi tried not to identify as their commander's blood. The young gunner's face was pale, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply shock. They ran. There was no shame in admitting it later because there was no choice in the moment. They ran through jungle that grabbed at their uniforms with thorny vines, through mud that sucked at their boots, through air that felt too thick to breathe. Behind them, the sounds of battle continued, but ahead lay only the dense green uncertainty of survival. For 2 days, they moved through the jungle, avoiding both American patrols and their own scattered forces. They had no radio, limited ammunition, and only the emergency rations from their tank, which Sato had grabbed in a moment of clear thinking. Tanaka developed a fever on the first night, shaking violently as they huddled in the hollow of a massive tree root. Takeshi shared his water, knowing it meant they would run out faster, but unable to watch the young man suffer without trying to help. On the 3rd day, they heard voices speaking English. The patrol appeared through the undergrowth with startling suddenness, 6 American soldiers with weapons raised and expressions that mixed wariness with something like relief. Takeshi raised his hand slowly, saying the only English word he knew with certainty. Surrender. Sato did the same, supporting Tanaka, who could barely stand. One of the Americans, a sergeant with kind eyes and a thick Brooklyn accent Takeshi would later learn to recognize, lowered his rifle and called for a medic. The prisoner of war camp near Port Moresby was not what Takeshi had expected. The propaganda he had been fed spoke of Allied brutality, of prisoners tortured and executed. Instead, he found himself in a compound where the guards were stern but not cruel, where medical staff treated Tanaka's fever, and where the food, while bland, came regularly. It was here, in a tent surrounded by other captured Japanese soldiers, that Takeshi began to understand the magnitude of what he had left behind. The interrogation came 5 days after their capture. An intelligence officer, Captain Robert Morrison, sat across from Takeshi in a sweltering tent, a translator at his side. Morrison was in his 30s, with the careful movements of someone who thought before acting. He did not threaten or intimidate. Instead, he asked questions about Takeshi's background, his family, his work before the war. He asked about fishing boats and engine repair, and Takeshi found himself talking more than he intended, starved for conversation that felt human rather than military. Then Morrison pulled out photographs, reconnaissance images of Japanese tanks, including what Takeshi recognized immediately as his own Type 97. The American captain leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "We need to understand this machine," he said through the translator. "Not to kill your comrades, but to end this war faster, to save lives on both sides. Every day this war continues, more young men like you and your crew die in metal boxes under the jungle sun." Takeshi said nothing at first. Loyalty to his emperor, to his nation, to his fallen commander, all demanded his silence. But he thought of Lieutenant Yamada's blood dripping from the turret ceiling. He thought of Tanaka's fever-bright eyes and trembling hands. He thought of his father back in their fishing village, who had taught him that the true purpose of understanding machines was to keep men safe while they did their work. What Takeshi did not realize, what he could not have known, was that the Type 97 Chiha tank he had spent 6 weeks operating contained technical modifications that Japanese command had not widely documented. The engine mounting system his unit had received incorporated improvements meant to address chronic overheating issues in tropical conditions. The armor plating had been adjusted based on battlefield experience from earlier campaigns in China. These were not revolutionary changes, but they represented evolutionary steps in Japanese tank doctrine that Allied intelligence desperately needed to understand. Over the following weeks, in a series of careful conversations, Takeshi described the mechanical systems of his tank in detail. He did not share tactical information or troop movements. Those were not his to give, and the interrogators did not press for them. Instead, he explained the engine's quirks, the transmission's tendencies, the gun's loading mechanism. He drew diagrams from memory, his mechanical training allowing him to recall details that surprised even Morrison. He described the modifications his unit had made in the field, the adjustments that kept the tanks running in conditions that would have defeated earlier models. What made Takeshi's information invaluable was not just its technical accuracy, but its practical nature. He did not speak as an engineer describing theoretical specifications, but as a mechanic and operator explaining how the machine actually performed under combat conditions. He described where the armor was weakest, not from studying blueprints, but from repairing damage. He explained the engine's vulnerabilities, not from a manual, but from keeping it running through heat and humidity that seemed designed to destroy mechanical systems. The intelligence that Morrison extracted from these conversations, cross-referenced with information from the abandoned tank itself and other sources, became part of a comprehensive assessment that changed how Allied forces approached Japanese armor in the Pacific Theater. It informed the development of anti-tank tactics specifically adapted to the Type 97's characteristics. It helped predict Japanese tank deployment patterns based on the mechanical limitations Takeshi had described. It contributed to intelligence estimates about Japanese industrial capacity and their ability to produce and maintain armored vehicles. But perhaps more importantly, it provided American tank crews with specific knowledge that saved lives. Knowing exactly where the Type 97's armor was thinnest allowed American gunners to target those weak points with greater precision, ending engagements faster and reducing the risk of prolonged combat. Understanding the engine's vulnerabilities helped Allied forces develop tactics to disable rather than destroy Japanese tanks, which reduced casualties on both sides and occasionally led to more prisoners being taken rather than fought to the death. Takeshi never saw himself as a hero or a traitor. In quiet moments at the POW camp, he struggled with what he had done. Sato, the former schoolteacher, offered perspective during their long conversations in the shade of the camp's perimeter fence. "We did not give them our nation's secrets," Sato said quietly. "We gave them the truth about a machine. Machines are not loyal to flags. They follow the laws of physics and metallurgy. By helping them understand our tank, you may have shortened encounters where that tank would be used, saved the lives of young men like Tanaka on both sides. Tanaka himself, recovered from his fever but still bearing the psychological scars of that day in the turret, sat nearby during these conversations, saying little but listening intently. He had been the youngest, the least experienced, thrust into horror he was not prepared for. The prisoner of war camp, with its routine and relative safety, had given him space to process what he had experienced. "I just wanted to go home," he said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "I still just want to go home." The war in the Pacific ground on for another 2 years after Takeshi's capture. He did not know, could not have known, the specific ways his information was used. He did not hear the American tank commanders discussing the best angles of attack against Type 97s, based partly on intelligence derived from his descriptions. He did not see the tactical manuals updated with information about Japanese armor capabilities that he had helped provide. He was simply a prisoner, working in the camp garden, learning broken English from friendly guards, and trying to reconcile his choices with the values he had been raised with. When news of Japan's surrender reached the POW camp in August 1945, Takeshi felt neither joy nor sorrow, only a profound exhaustion and a desperate hope that he might somehow find his way home. The repatriation process was slow, complicated by logistics and the sheer number of prisoners scattered across the Pacific. It was December before Takeshi, Sato, and Tanaka found themselves on a transport ship heading back to Japan, 3 survivors among thousands, each carrying the weight of their experiences in silence. The Japan they returned to was transformed beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, and the psychological impact of defeat hung over everything like smoke from extinguished fires. Takeshi made his way back to his village outside Yokohama to find his family's home still standing, a small miracle amid widespread destruction. His father had aged a decade in the years Takeshi had been gone, but the old man's hands were still steady as he embraced his son, asking no questions about where he had been or what he had done. Takeshi returned to repairing engines, first for fishing boats, then for the vehicles that began appearing as Japan slowly rebuilt. He married a woman from a neighboring village who had lost her first husband in the war, and understood the silences that sometimes fell over him. They had 2 children, and Takeshi taught them about engines and machinery, passing on his father's lessons about the importance of understanding how things worked. He never spoke publicly about what he had done during the war. In a nation grappling with defeat and occupation, stories of surrender and cooperation with the enemy were not welcomed. But in private moments, in conversations with Sato, who had become a teacher again and occasionally visited, Takeshi found a measure of peace with his choices. "We were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor," Sato reflected during one such visit. "But perhaps the real dishonor would have been to die needlessly, to refuse to see our enemies as human beings worthy of the same desire to survive that we felt." It was not until decades later, when historians began piecing together the details of Pacific intelligence operations, that the fuller picture emerged. Documents declassified in the 1970s and 80s revealed the extent to which prisoner interrogations had contributed to Allied understanding of Japanese military capabilities. Takeshi's name appeared in some of these documents, his information credited with contributing to significant intelligence assessments about Japanese armored capabilities. By then, he was an old man, his children grown with families of their own, his wife gray-haired but still patient with his occasional nightmares. A researcher from Tokyo University found him in 1983, asking for an interview about his experiences. Takeshi was initially reluctant, but something in the young historian's earnest face reminded him of Tanaka, and he agreed to talk. Over several days, he described his experiences in detail for the first time outside of military interrogations. He spoke of the heat inside the tank, of Lieutenant Yamada's blood, of the decision to share technical information with Captain Morrison. The historian listened without judgment, taking careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but never questioning Takeshi's choices. When the interview was published as part of a larger academic work on prisoner of war experiences, it generated surprising attention. Veterans from both sides reached out, some to condemn, but many more to share their own stories of survival and compromise, of choosing life over ideology in moments of crisis. An American veteran named Thomas Bradley, who had been a tank commander in the Pacific, wrote to Takeshi through the publisher. Bradley's letter was simple but profound. "Thank you," it read. "I don't know if the intelligence you provided specifically saved my life, but it contributed to our understanding of what we faced. That understanding made us better at our jobs, which meant we could do them more efficiently and hopefully with less loss on both sides. You helped us see your tanks not as invincible enemy weapons, but as machines with strengths and weaknesses, operated by men like ourselves." Takeshi kept that letter until his death in 1994, at the age of 74. His children found it among his papers, along with the faded photographs from his youth and a small mechanical diagram he had drawn during his imprisonment, showing the engine assembly of a Type 97 Chi-Ha tank. At his funeral, Sato spoke briefly about their shared experiences, describing Takeshi as a man who had faced impossible choices with courage and humanity. Tanaka, older now but still carrying the young man's uncertainty in his eyes, simply bowed deeply before Takeshi's photograph, his expression saying what words could not. The story of how a Japanese tanker inadvertently gave America crucial intelligence about his country's armored vehicles is not one of betrayal or heroism in the traditional sense. It is a story about survival, about the complex moral territory that war creates, and about how individual choices made in moments of desperation can ripple through history in unexpected ways. Takeshi Nakamura did not set out to change the course of the war. He simply tried to survive, and in surviving, made choices that seemed right to him in those moments. The technical intelligence he provided contributed to a larger mosaic of understanding that helped Allied forces fight more effectively against Japanese armor. That effectiveness likely shortened some engagements, reduced casualties in specific encounters, and contributed incrementally to the Allied victory in the Pacific. But it also saved Japanese lives by making battles shorter and less drawn out, by occasionally leading to the capture rather than destruction of Japanese forces, and by helping both sides understand each other's capabilities more clearly. In the end, Takeshi's legacy is not found in the military records or historical assessments, though those exist and acknowledge his contribution. It is found in the lives that continued because of choices made in a moment of crisis, in the children and grandchildren of soldiers on both sides who existed because their ancestors survived encounters that might have ended differently. It is found in the reminder that even in war, especially in war, we remain human beings capable of choosing compassion over ideology, survival over abstract loyalty, and the messy complexity of real life over the simplified narratives that conflict demands. The Second World War produced millions of stories, most of them lost to time, buried with the men and women who lived them. But some stories survive, passed down through families, preserved in declassified documents, remembered by historians who understand that the truth of war is found not in the grand strategies, but in the individual moments when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances and did their best to remain human. Takeshi Nakamura's story is one of these, a reminder that sometimes the most significant contributions to history are made not by heroes or villains, but by people simply trying to survive and maintain their humanity in the process. The rusted hulk of a Type 97 Chi-Ha tank sits in a museum in Australia today, recovered from the jungles of New Guinea decades after the war. It may or may not be the specific tank that Takeshi Nakamura operated. The records are incomplete, and many tanks of that model fought in that region. But it serves as a memorial to all the young men who found themselves crammed into metal boxes in the tropical heat, fighting a war that most of them barely understood, making choices that would echo through their lives and sometimes through history itself. And perhaps, in some small way, it stands as testament to the idea that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, there remains the possibility of choosing understanding over hatred, survival over sacrifice, and the difficult, complicated truth over comfortable lies.